Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Resolution Foundation this morning. We are here at the start of term to give you your cheat sheet. We have looked at all of the key issues on the public's mind and the government's mind, and today with UK in a Changing Europe published a series of evidence-led, research-based assessments of the key issues politicians will confront. And we have a panel of truly expert tutors to guide your revision today. So we hope that this will get you back to school with a bang. Delighted to be joined, as I say, by some of the authors in the essay collection, and nice to have some others in the audience too. David Bailey from the Birmingham Business School, Anita Charlesworth from the Health Foundation, and of course Anna Menon from Director of UK in a Changing Europe, who are really the driving force behind today's publication, and Rob Ford, Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester, who's joining us virtually, and we're all praying for obedient technology. So before we get into some of the issues, just one bit of context setting from me. You might be surprised to learn that because our collection is based on issues top of the public's mind, the first one is not how to meet the fiscal rules, but we know that is on Westminster's mind, and we know the outlook for the budget is looking tricky. The Chancellor has spent over £6 billion on policy U-turns since the March forecast. Gilt yields have moved in a way that will cost over £3 billion if they sustain till the OBR does its next forecast. And that means she's out of headroom to her fiscal rules even before we get into judgments the OBR might make about growth. And that is really why there's a lot of talk about what will happen on tax as we all come back and politics comes back with a bang. She's done a spending review in June. The government's committed its departmental allocations, and given all the controversy around welfare changes this summer, it seems unlikely that spending is the place the government will go. And that, rather than the promotion of Resolution Foundation alumni, is why we're all talking about tax. And we've got at least 10 weeks to talk about tax because we don't have a date for the budget yet. So that means it's probably sometime in the second half of November. And so I commend to you the essay in the collection from Isaac from the Institute for Fiscal Studies on tax, which makes 2 points really powerfully, I think. The first is that the tax system is not in a great place and reform is needed. So it is not a pipe dream to say that we might improve the fairness of the tax system and also raise some revenue at the same time. I'm going to read you a bit of Isaac's because he puts it so well. A needlessly opaque system which imposes an unjustified penalty on income from employment, drags on growth and makes revenue raising more costly than it needs to be. The second point, which the IFS have made before, is that the huge majority, 75% of revenue, come from those tax bases, VAT, NICs, income tax, corporation tax, that the government has promised in its manifesto not to touch. And so the really big question for this budget is whether they can do enough without touching those taxes, and that looks potentially difficult. We also had a lot of economic data over the summer, and we will come to talk about growth very shortly. Some good news there in the GDP data through the summer, but some much more worrying trends in the labour market. At the Resolution Foundation, we've done some work on what's really going on in unemployment in particular, and it looks to us like that has not yet peaked, and that we, despite the challenges of the labour force survey, should take very seriously the indications it's giving us that is on the rise. So I think at the heart of both of those challenges, and as Anand and I set out in the introduction, if only the government could get a bit of growth, a lot of these problems in the book would get easier. So I thought we would start with David, who's written an excellent piece on industrial strategy and how that links to the government's growth strategy, and get your reflections, David.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. So, growth is the number one problem. Without it, we can't do the things that we want to do as a nation, whether it's to spend more on public services or improve our public realm more generally. But growth has been weak for a long time, ever since the global financial crisis, in fact. We were growing at 2 to 2.5% a year up until that point. Since then, growth has been a lot slower. We've also, of course, had the impact of Brexit, COVID, and other things. So growth is the number one priority. The government says that. It also says that it will increase living standards by the end of the Parliament. Now, what's the government trying to do about that? It's trying to undertake some quite sensible supply-side reforms across a range of different issues. So improving the planning system to build 1.5 million homes, speeding up infrastructure, an industrial strategy, yay, again, at last, targeting 8 key sectors, the adoption of AI and other new technologies to boost productivity across the economy, incentives for investment in energy, and a trade strategy. That's all good. But I think what comes through in several of the chapters really well is that there's a feeling that the government may have pulled its punches in some senses. And if we're going to put growth as the number one objective, we need to be paraphrasing a famous Prime Minister, tough on growth and tough on the drivers of growth. And essentially, there's a feeling that certainly when it comes to planning, the government didn't go far enough. So even as though the planning and infrastructure bill goes through Parliament, there's already discussion about the need for a second bill because it didn't do enough. The great chapter by Paul Cheshire in the collection particularly about housing and the Green Belt. And having been involved in a dispute about the Green Belt 10 years ago in Birmingham, where some of us were trying to get a tiny slither, a pizza slice of the Green Belt unlocked, that took a decade. And that was about homes, it was about jobs, it was about expanding business. That has got to be changed. So that's a huge issue. Maybe the government hasn't gone far enough on planning. On the industrial strategy, it's great to have one, but there's concerns about whether there's enough financial clout there to actually do it properly, and also whether there's enough of a placed-based element to devolve it down to a more regional and local level, or whether it's going to be a top-down sort of process. Finally, on trade, I know Anand was going to talk about this as well, but there is a trade strategy now. Again, that is useful. But let's bear in mind that the deal with the US was really damage limitation. It isn't going to boost the economy. It's going to mitigate some of the damage from Trump. And on the European Union, yes, the reset was very beneficial, but the government's own red lines mitigate against some really growth-enhancing changes, rolling out the single market and the customs union. So there's a sense that despite the government's objective being growth, there's a kind of cognitive dissonance within government about whether you come to some of the key reforms needed to actually undertake the growth. So that's why I'm concerned that all of these measures are great. Will they do enough? Will they do it quickly enough? That's still up in the air, I think.
Great, thanks, David. Look, that's a fantastic framing. So let's get that from everyone and then draw out some of the implications. I mean, Anita, we're talking a lot about tax in the news, but we just had a spending review. NHS is still top of the public's mind. Does it have what it needs to reduce waiting lists and other things?
Well, it has as much as it has any realistic expectation of getting. So I think actually one of the things for the NHS is it needs to shift its mindset to say, this is how much we are going to get. It's now our job to actually get on with making that deliver. And that reflects the political context at the moment. It's very interesting. So, Wes Streeting has been very clear, and perhaps only a Labour government can be as tough in the rhetoric on this with the NHS, that he doesn't see the answer to the NHS as ever more money, but he sees the answer as fundamentally reform. And so they've published their 10-year health plan now. What's very striking about that is having listened in and read the debate when Wes Streeting launched that, there is almost no political disagreement with the direction of travel. So the amount of consistent focus on, so it's got 3 shifts as he talks about within this plan. So moving from hospital to community, from treatment to prevention, from an analogue health service to a digital health service. You could have written variations of that over the last 30 years. Everybody agrees with it. People in the NHS agree with it. Experiences, each time we write policy papers that say that, strategies, and commit to that. What happens in the NHS is that we have a more hospital-centric, more rescue service, and we've just about got rid of fax machines, but we are still way behind where we should be on new technology. But there is enormous opportunity, and anyone who listens to Radio 4 this morning will have heard again about this amazing development with AI and stroke. And I actually think, the Today programme has the Thought for the Day at 10 to 8. They could now have the Tech in Health inspirational moment, because actually almost every day at the moment, there is some example of innovation which could transform people's lives. So we have enormous opportunity, and the opportunity actually is not just for the health service. One of the big effects of, you've got to think of COVID for the NHS was a bit what the financial crash was for the economy. So we had a massive hit on our productivity and we've not recovered. We're about 9% below pre-pandemic levels. Now, actually, health is 10% of our economy. So actually how the health service does is important for our health, but actually as a feedback loop into our economy as well. And how we do on health, because it's not just our health service that's struggling, we're actually going backwards on health outcomes. And I think this is actually quite fundamental. Most generations think that what they will bequeath to their children and their grandchildren is a more prosperous and a healthier nation. And both of those sort of given expectations are looking very, very shaky at the moment. So I guess thinking about the reforms then, sort of everyone's in agreement, but the trick the government's got to pull off now is to achieve something that multiple previous generations haven't done and turn that rhetoric into reality. And here I think there are, the positive headwinds are the opportunity of the new technology, which is a massive positive headwind, and the enormous agreement and the imperative that there isn't really a plan B. The big risks for them are that, a bit like in the industrial strategy, there's a dose response gap. So the dosage of many of the interventions in the health plan is a bit homeopathic, and we need chemotherapy in many cases. And so there is a timidity so we're going to do neighbourhood health, but actually we'll have 42 little individual health centres essentially in parts of the country. Well, I mean, that won't touch the sides. You've got to believe in things and scale up and commit. So there's a dose response question. There's a really interesting coherence question about public service reform, where health, I think, is just playing out wider, lack of clarity. So I can read the health plan and think this is a return to quasi-markets and a belief in quasi-markets with foundation trusts and this idea of strategic commissioning. I can read the 10-year health plan and think this is about devolution. And this is all about decentralisation, and we're going to do that. And I can read the 10-year health plan and pick bits and say, this is about performance management, grip and control. And one thing that we know that really bedevils successful delivery of public service reform is coherence and alignment of policies. And at the moment, when you read the 10-year health plan, what you see is different actors who have all had their idea and no one actually imposing a coherent view on it. And in one sense, that might be a geek fest, but actually it does really matter, because in something as complex as the health service, you need clear organising, framing narratives, because you can't actually control every little bit from the centre, and you need to pull people, you need to have incentives that are aligned, that push people in the same direction. So actually, I don't think that's just geeky. And then the third thing I'm going to draw on is very heavily on, Jeff Mulgan wrote a very good academic paper and then a piece in Substack about poetry, prose and plumbing. Yeah, and the importance of plumbing, of actually having the technical capability and infrastructure to do stuff. And all of the whizzy AI depends on an NHS having a core technical infrastructure, for example, and it's much less exciting than, and you won't get a section on the Today programme about that, but it really matters that we're not there. And then the final thing is the NHS is not an island. The 10-year plan says almost nothing about social care. Social care has been kicked down the road again. Louise Casey is reviewing it. She will be brilliant, but her timescales extend so far on that, you really have questions. And then a lot of the things that actually are the causes of our fraying health, very fraying health, are obviously things that are the job of the Resolution Foundation and the industrial strategy and housing and everything else.
Great, thanks so much, Anita. And there's a theme coming out already about the rhetoric. There being quite a lot of consensus on the rhetoric, whether it's the things to do on growth or the themes in the health plan, but they're not really being a face up to the trade-offs required to make those radical enough. What do you both think is kind of holding the government back from being bolder?
In part, their own red lines. So their concern, for example, about what's happened with Brexit, they don't want to reopen that. So whereas they probably could have gone much further. There's an element of NIMBYism, of course, when it comes to planning and the pushback against that. And also there may well be disagreement, of course, within the Labour Party about how far these things should go.
Anita?
I think one of the things that is quite difficult, and you see this in health, is to what extent do you govern for 2 terms or 1? So do you just go for keeping everything as steady as you can, picking a couple of things, waiting list, for example, go for that, hope you get for a second term, or actually are you governing for 2 terms, recognising that for that it's about long-term reform, but if it's about long-term and fundamental reform, you might sacrifice some immediate performance. And I get that, and can you ride both those horses? And you can almost see, and you see this slightly obviously with changing of people at the centre camps, they're really deeply torn about that.
Really interesting. And Adam, I'm sure you've got views on that, and why don't you tell us about your reflections on foreign policy and Brexit as well?
Yeah, I mean, on the general point, I suppose just reading the collection as a whole, 3 things occurred to me. One is just how long-term some of the problems we face are. These aren't things that have come up recently. You say in your piece, Anita, we're having the same discussion for a couple of decades. But while we have long-term problems, we increasingly have short-term policies. I mean, there's a lovely bit in David's piece where he just says, the key thing about industrial policy is how long...
I'm not sure the sound's working, and you're saying such interesting things, I wouldn't want that to be missed.
Assuming you're being sarcastic then. But can you hear me now?
Yes.
You have long-term problems with short-term policy, which is an awful combination. David in his piece talks about the fact that we've had all sorts of industrial policies over the last 20 years. They never last.
No.
Everything is done with a sort of short-term view, and that's a sort of structural political economy thing that we should really worry about in this country. The other thing that strikes me, just the thing overall, is the increasing tension between campaigning and governing. The way in which governments to be lock themselves into ridiculous situations, either by overpromising, stop the boats, smash the gangs, which give the impression of simple answers to very, very complex problems, or by tying their own hands, tax, in order to get elected, which will have enormous implications up for their ability to govern. So they're the sort of 3 broad points that come out to me when I read the collection as a whole. Just very, very quickly on foreign policy and Brexit. Foreign policy, I mean, the key word for me with foreign policy is fragility. I think Keir Starmer has played a very difficult hand very, very well to date in reconciling not just the conflicting pressures of trying to have decent relations with the Americans and the Europeans and the Chinese simultaneously, but also managing a parliamentary party that is deeply dissatisfied with what's going on in Gaza. My fear about foreign policy is his ability to, if you think about it as a plate spinner, spin all those plates simultaneously going forward, because it's a very vulnerable position we find ourselves in. And if, for instance, you envisage a major trade war between the EU and the US, the danger for us is that we are pushed into a situation of having to choose sides. So he's done very, very well so far, but the situation looks very fragile. And on Brexit, I mean, Brexit is quite simple, isn't it? In the sense, never thought I'd say that, but it's simple in the sense that the government quite clearly hasn't simply decided that growth is its priority. There are other things that are bigger priorities than growth. You see that in immigration policy. You see it very clearly on the policy on Brexit. The sort of cumulative economic impact of the reset, should they manage to get the stuff that they've now agreed to negotiate, is significantly under 1% of GDP. The cumulative impact of Brexit, as we know, is significantly higher. but that is a red line that the government has put there of its own making. Again, it was a promise given in order to win an election. It's going to get in the way of their policies around growth, but there is very, very little prospect, I think, of them revisiting that.
And any reflections on trade more generally, and where the government's landed and navigated through all of that?
Again, I mean, a pretty good performance to date. Trade is being used quite sensibly as a way of trying to contribute to growth. I think, I was surprised that they got what they got with India. With the United States, who the hell knows how long that's going to hold for, because it seems to me, again, that Trump is capable of changing his mind from one day to the next. But on balance, I would say, a lot of people sort of on social media this morning have sort of tweeted out this report, have written back and said, is there any good news? And I actually think on trade policy and on foreign policy, yes, there is a bit of good news. The government has handled a very difficult situation about as well as you could have expected it to do so.
That's very optimistic from you.
That's very unlike me, I know.
Rob, let's come to you. Any reflections on the discussion and on the political volatility at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, on the discussion, I think the points made about governments binding themselves and making undeliverable promises in elections, well, we're seeing the bill for that come due much more rapidly than perhaps we did in parliaments gone by. So the Labour Party was elected with 34.5% 14 months ago. They've since lost somewhere in the region of 15% of that vote. If you go back a little bit further, people forget now that Labour were dropping all the way through the general election campaign as well. So if you go back to the start of 2024, they were in the mid-40s, which means they've lost more than half of their vote in 18 months. Meanwhile, the opposition Conservative Party have done something which no opposition in history has ever done before, which is that they've continued to drop very sharply, even after losing office, which means we're now in an unprecedented situation where a new party has been leading the polls. I went and checked this just before we started. Reform have led every single poll since mid-April. I don't think there has ever been such a long period of time in which a party not called Labour or the Conservatives has led every single poll. The SDP led a few polls in the early 80s when they first came along, but such a long stretch has never happened before. That is unprecedented volatility. I mean, if we go a little bit further back in time, incidentally, it's almost exactly 4 years ago that the Conservatives were polling around 45%, and Tim Shipman was telling us that Boris Johnson would be squatting like a giant toad in the road of British politics for much of the coming decade. So things are changing with unprecedented rapidity. And on the policy front, I think that brings a number of challenges for what is still a relatively young government. First of all, it brings challenges when dealing with the other elected institutions across Britain, local authorities in England, devolved authorities in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, because that volatility is already manifesting itself in voting behaviour. We saw a record turnover of seats in the council elections last May. We look set to see considerable change potentially in Wales and Scotland next May as well. Labour will therefore have to be dealing with elected officials and of course also in the mayoral combined authorities, which they're setting up many more of those in coming years. They're going to have to deal with a lot of elected politicians from parties other than theirs, often new elected politicians who have campaigned against them. Secondly, you get problems at the centre as well. Another feature of last year's general election is you had a record number of MPs elected with really rather small majorities for the governing Labour Party, but they face different kinds of local opposition. Here in Manchester, where I am right now, the local opposition is the Greens. If you go down the road into Lancashire, you'll have seats where the local opposition is the Conservatives. Go further down the road and you'll find seats where the Liberal Democrats are the local opposition. And so Labour MPs face different challenges locally, but don't have a big cushion of votes. And that's liable, based on past behaviour and indeed already recent behaviour in this government, to produce greater rebelliousness in Parliament, but rebellions in different directions. the government has shown a desire to try and neutralise reforms appeal on issues of immigration. That may well appeal to red wall Labour MPs who face a reform challenge, but it may antagonise MPs worried about a green challenge. Of course, we have a green leadership election today. That may increase the challenge on the left. There's also the potential for another challenge on the left from the Corbyn Labour Party too. And the third sort of big picture challenge, coming back to that question of 1 term or 2 terms. I mean, normally you would think a government elected with such a huge majority would be thinking in terms of 2 terms. But in the current volatile environment, that can't be taken for granted at all. But when you combine volatility and fragmentation with the first past the post electoral system, it becomes very difficult for the current government to know what sort of election campaign it's going to need to run in 4 years. It's not even clear what their main opposition will be. I mean, right now it looks like Reform, but 4 years ago it looked like the Conservatives. 2 years ago it looked like the Conservatives. Who knows where it will look like 2 years from now? So they probably can't take for granted that they'll win another term, nor can they take for granted what sort of party they need to face in the general election campaign, or what sort of campaign they therefore need to run. That, I think, to put it mildly, makes making policy in the next few years rather challenging.
That does all sound a bit tricky, Rob. I guess I'm struck that it's easy for us to sit here and say we'd like the government to take on the NIMBYs a bit more. We'd like them to govern for 2 terms, not 1. We'd like them to stop using simple slogans to complex problems. But do they have that space, or is that kind of an unrealistic set of demands from a panel of experts?
Is this aimed at me first?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is whatever the government has been doing in the last year, in polling terms, evidently has not worked. And it does seem that a lot of what they've been doing has been attempting to sort of compete with the parties on their right, in particular, on their own terrain. It hasn't worked. It is, in my view, unlikely to work for one very big and obvious reason, which is that if you are in government, you cannot deliver simple solutions to complex problems. The whole of this report is one long illustration of that. But when you are in opposition, you are not constrained in the same way, and the public aren't required to take your excuses seriously and aren't inclined to take your excuses seriously. So if you try and make arguments of the form, well, Nigel Farage has a point, but don't vote for him, you're going to lose that argument. It would be much better, I think, for the government to set out what it is trying to do, how long it will take, what it will cost, and then let voters decide for themselves, rather than trying to promise what cannot be delivered, to compete with populists on their own sloganeering terrain, because that's a losing game in government. It's always been a losing game in government, but it's particularly a losing game in government now, when voters are so volatile, so distrusting of politicians in general, and so prone to seek radical alternative solutions. So I think they will probably be better off just doing what they think is best in the interests of the country and letting the chips fall where they may.
Interesting. And Anne?
I mean, just to reinforce that. I mean, whether the government wins or not next time round, it's vanishingly unlikely they're going to win with a majority of 170 again. And they've got that massive majority in the House of Commons now. And it was just, I mean, the sad thing about it was such a good opportunity to tackle at least one of the big problems we face. It could have been social care, it could have been property taxation, it could have been any one of those things. And I suppose the shame is to think, what would be awful is you get to the end of these 5 years and think you had this enormous governing majority and you didn't deploy it for anything. And that's the thing that worries me, I think.
And so what would everyone's one thing be if they've got 6 months left to change tack, to use the majority for something bold? What would you use it for?
Council tax.
You spent too much time with Paul.
You reban council tax. As part of that, you have a rethink about local government financing, because one of the pieces we haven't talked about in the report, the piece by Tony Travers about local government, is, even by the high standards of this report, very grim. In terms of both the potential of losing accountability as we lose huge numbers of councillors under the reforms being implemented, but secondly, just because councils have no money and core services are not being delivered. So I would do council tax, I think.
Anita?
On the spend side, I do think that one of the things that's really important in what they choose is to create a sense of belief and hope that things can be fundamentally better, and can be fundamentally better without us all being bankrupt on the spending side. And I do think that because they're not going to change anything, but actually we need to give a sense of hope and a belief that the state can be effective, can be nimble. And so I would go pretty strongly on the AI across public services, not because I think it's a panacea, but because I think it could show and be a clear and demonstrable example of how actually if government embraces that complexity that Rob was talking about well and is competent, then actually an enabling an effective state is a possible thing.
And is that achievable with fax machines only just left behind?
So not across the board, but actually there is a lot you could do. Yeah, there is a lot you could do.
Okay. David, your thing?
I don't think there is one golden bullet, but if I think, well, what one thing could we do to genuinely lift our long-run rate of growth, then it would be around planning and infrastructure. I mean, every time I drive out of Birmingham, I see High Speed 2 inching closer towards us. I'm thinking, my goodness, how long is this going to take? That's crazy. We've got to change that.
And do you think there's enough money now in infrastructure and it's a question of delivery and planning? Or
so on most of it will be private money. Let's face it, the government is so constrained. But I think that what's useful about the industrial strategy, and also if we can further reform planning and infrastructure, it sends very clear signals to the market that the government is going to do that. And this is about de-risking investment opportunities, providing certainty, and trying to unlock potential private sector growth.
And you mentioned in your essay the government's innovation in terms of bringing private money in, of the National Wealth Fund. How do you see all of that? Do you think it's going to work?
So that's a really good question. And I think that's, we've had all sorts of experiments in the past in terms of investment banks and so on. There is an argument to have this in terms of where there are gaps in the market, in terms of trying to speed up the market so that we can get to net zero more quickly. But it's got to be really well targeted. That requires very professional management, very clear criteria, and it's got to, coming back to the point about short term and long term, that's got to show some wins very quickly about crowding in private investment to get things done quickly.
Rob, do you have one thing you think the government should do to improve its standing?
Well, I mean, I agree that I don't think that there are any sort of silver bullets to solve all of these problems. But the one thing I would propose would unlock a lot of things, which is electoral system reform. When we have five-party politics, when we have fragmentation at the level that we do, the first past the post-electoral system becomes a kind of catalyst for further volatility and makes elections extremely unpredictable. So we could go into the next general election looking at a situation where if Reform gets, say, 26%, they have 50 seats, but if Reform get a few percentage points more, they suddenly have a majority. That makes every aspect of long-term policy making more difficult because it becomes very hard to predict who will be in government and what they want 5 years from now. It also isn't something voters like because it means that very large numbers of voters are not reliably represented in the legislative institutions in accordance with the shares of the votes that they're casting. So I would favour shifting to an electoral system that better accommodates pluralism and fragmentation of the kind that is clearly there in the electorate right now, and that would make it easier to predict the kinds of governments we're likely to get going forward, and therefore easier to make policy for the long term across the entire piece.
Thanks, Rob. Since we've got such a great audience here, I'd like to give you a chance to ask questions if anyone would like to. If anyone would like to ask a question on Slido, you can also do that with #PolicyLandscape. If not, I will bring one up online if we've got an unusually shy audience. I thought this question brought out this point about trade-offs. So from an economic perspective, what would be the best manifesto commitment to break? And I suppose there is this sense that the government has been trying to navigate an extremely difficult path through its commitment to public services, its promises on tax, its constraint in terms of growth and Brexit that we've talked about. And if it's going to be bolder, can it keep all of those red lines, or does it need to move away from one of them? We've talked a bit about this, but Anand, your reflections?
I mean, I would say tax law, because it will be the quickest in a sense. Brexit, you get rid of your Brexit red lines, you've still got a long negotiation, then a long implementation. You're not going to see the benefits of that for a long, long time. I actually thought the government had a real opportunity when Trump came in, and particularly straight after the Oval Office meeting with Zelensky. I was half expecting Keir Starmer to turn up in Parliament and say, you know, we campaigned in a time of peace, we're governing in a time of war. The assumptions on which we based our manifesto no longer hold. This is a new world, higher defence spending. So I come to you to say we're going to have to do things differently. And I thought that was just a golden opportunity to do that sort of thing. But I think if I was to break one of them, the tax law.
Anita, your thoughts?
I get the. I was also very confused about not the desire to sort of carry on after that, and it's very interesting as well that Germany didn't take that stance, and actually doesn't, and markets seem to have borne that. You know, having said that, I do actually think in this sense these are interconnected, because. If markets don't believe that you have a credible growth strategy, then they are going to be very worried about you. I mean, they are right on the right thing. Without growth, nothing works. So I guess if I was I would be in thinking about which commitment I'm going to break. I would be very, very focused on if I'm going to use really significant political capital, it's got to deliver growth.
Yeah. David?
I think they're all pretty good to break, actually, but I'm not a politician, am I? So, look, the government is trying to increase spending on public services. It said it won't increase national insurance, VAT, income tax, and it wants to keep the bond markets happy. I don't think it's going to be able to do all of those things. So something's going to have to give, and that might bring us back to the fiscal framework. But I think Anand's absolutely right. I think that there was a moment where Starmer could have said, look, we're going to have to rearm. We're going to have to cooperate more with our European partners. That's going to require a major investment. He could have said, right, we're not going to count that in terms of the fiscal framework. Now, some of it doesn't count because that extra defence spending, which is capital, that's okay, but the current spending, and Germany did that. They eliminated the debt brake. They're going big in terms of expenditure on defence and infrastructure. And as you said, the bond markets, they haven't really blinked. So there was an opportunity to do that was missed. But they are all linked. And I think unless the government does look at the Brexit red lines, that is going to act as a drag on growth, which means less tax revenue, less ability to spend. So we're going to have to think about this holistically.
And is Anand right that kind of Brexit takes too long, or actually would that send a signal to the markets that it might get some benefits?
Yes, that's a very good point. I think that, yes, it will take a long time in terms of negotiation. Also, we don't know what the EU is willing to accommodate. I mean, they may allow us to cherry pick where they want it, but not in other areas. But as a signal to investors that actually there's going to be a closer relationship, that could be quite a quick impact. Remember, when there was the referendum result, the impact on investment was almost immediate. The impact on trade took a lot longer. But in terms of boosting investment, that could have an impact quickly.
So that being said, following on from what Rob said, if I were the European Union looking at the polling in the United Kingdom now, would I undertake a long and gruelling negotiation just to see Nigel Farage walk into number 10 and rip it all up?
Yeah.
I mean, you might give some concessions in order if you thought it was going to lead to a different outcome.
Yeah, the European Union hasn't got a great track record of giving concessions, I have to say. But.
I guess we are in the discussion conflating two things, though, one of which is, did Keir Starmer have a moment to raise taxes in order to pay for defence, and did he have a moment to borrow more in order to pay for defence? Jonathan Portes gives some reflections on that in the essay, which I'm inclined to agree with, which is that given what we've seen in terms of gilt yields, it does feel like Rachel Reeves did increase borrowing quite a lot, albeit with the justification of investment and capital rather than a defence-specific one, and that it's not clear that she does have loads of space to go there. I tend to agree that the question is, was there a moment where she could have, the government could have said, actually, things have changed and we need to change our approach to tax, and I guess question whether the autumn is too late.
I think you're right. I think there's going to be a heavy price to pay now in terms of the bond markets, because they've locked themselves in terms of not raising taxes, and if they change their fiscal rules, there'll be a price to pay. The point was they should never have done that in the first place, but we are where we are. That leaves them in very difficult territory.
It depends a little bit whether you think the kind of markets judge you relative to whether you change your rules or just relative to how much borrowing you're doing. But yeah. So Rob, it's not gone well in the first year. Maybe breaking the manifesto is the way to go. What do you think?
I think that the manifesto tax pledges were a real albatross around the neck of the government, and I think there are probably three strong reasons to want to break with that. There's a principled reason, which is the level of ambitious change that Labour was promising, or at least hinting at in the election campaign, can't be delivered without paying for it. And given that you can't borrow more, as we've been talking about, without the markets getting restive, that means you've got to increase taxes. And with the best will in the world, you're not going to raise the kind of revenue you need unless you raise the big taxes. So you can't do what you've said you're going to do unless you do this. So that's the principled reason. There's also a pragmatic argument, which is, if the reason for making this pledge was to hold together an election-winning coalition, well, that winning coalition has gone. You've lost more than half your vote already, even despite the fact that you've kept to your pledges already. So in a sense, you don't have a lot left to lose. You're not gambling as much when you've already lost so much ground in the first year, and by breaking the tax pledge, you're in a position to try and make some of it back by delivering on the outcomes. I think there's also a third strategic argument for this, which is how has it benefited Labour to keep the discussion off tax versus public spending? It has not benefited them at all. Instead, the discussion has been focused on areas where they are on even weaker terrain, in particular immigration and identity and so on, which has been the dominant theme for much of the recent months. Would it really be worse to pick a fight over tax and public services and say, we are the government who are going to spend the money needed to get our public services back on their feet? Is it actually a bad thing if Farage, whose positions on tax and spend are very inconsistent, or Badenoch were constantly talking about tax rises? That would lead to a discussion about what government is for, that's framed around the NHS, the public sector, delivering growth, rather than being framed around flags and immigration. I can't see how that would be a worse situation for Labour to be in than the one they're in now, even though the starting point would be you broke your promises.
And what about you broke your promises? What about what that does to trust in politicians? Is there kind of not a real constraint there?
I don't think there's really any evidence that the public punish governments very significantly for breaking these kinds of promises, largely because they expect governments of all stripes to break these promises all the time. I mean, look at how the previous Conservative government behaved in its first few years in office. How many of those things were promised in the 2019 manifesto? Aside from the Brexit deal, very few. If you go back further in time, I'm sure all of us on the panel are in fact old enough to remember the enormous neuralgia that Gordon Brown had about putting a penny on national insurance to fund the NHS, and the popularity of that Labour government went up after they did that. There have been numerous changes to our fiscal stance that weren't signalled in manifestos or were actively ruled out in manifestos, and I'm not really convinced that those are a primary driver of public views of governments in the way that a lot of people in politics seem to assume.
I'm not going to disagree with Rob, but I am going to argue, I think that trust actually does really matter. And one of the things that Anand talked about in the collection was how far we've got long-term challenges that require long-term response. And if people don't have any confidence in the government's ability to deliver on what they've said and create some kind of confidence and certainty, it has real world consequences. And lack of trust. I'll give two examples which I think are really problematic at the moment. So one is, my enormous optimism at the moment about innovation making huge differences on health. And the thing I'm hugely excited about is we're on a cusp of huge breakthroughs in vaccination, which are just phenomenal. And we're about to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, because at precisely the time we have these incredible breakthroughs, increasing numbers of people don't trust vaccines, and that has collapsed, and that has real world consequences. This year we've had a child die of whooping cough, we've had a child die from measles. This should never happen now. So trust has consequences there. Now, people aren't doing that because of the manifesto, but how, we have a decline in trust, which I think we have to worry about. The second thing is, if you take what people are doing at the moment on pensions, so, if you want people to save, if you want investment, for example, we have the commitment to 1.5 million homes, and yet, we're struggling to see that through. Part of that is obviously all the issues around planning reform, etc. But actually, people need to, if people are making long-term commitments and decisions, they have to have some sense of the world in which they'll be operating in, and whether or not what people say is actually going to happen. And a lot of economic growth is a great big confidence trick, isn't it? And you are saying, the world will be better, because of what we're doing. And then people go, the world will be better. I will make decisions to invest or do this. And then it becomes a better world because of that. And if we lack trust, we have broken one of our really important transmission mechanisms for policy to have beneficial effect.
You make a really good point. I do think it comes back a little bit to this kind of, is the right strategy, as they've done for the last year, to thread the needle, or is it to break free of something? And I think you could make a case that actually this autumn, if they were to break the tax lock or do something radical on tax that really reset the fiscal position and said, we have now dealt with this problem. It was too big to deal with in one budget, but we've dealt with it in two. We funded public services in a way that we think can deliver true transformative change. And that is now done. And the threat of tax is no longer kind of hanging over the economy in the same way, or at least we understand where the chips will fall if they have to come back a bit better than we do at the moment, that you might get a bit more economic certainty and growth from that.
I mean, it would obviously have helped if the Chancellor hadn't said what she said to the CBI last year about, I won't be coming back for more tax rises, which felt a bit badly judged at the time, to be honest. And I think Anita's absolutely right about trust. And, you see that in the state of our politics, which is, don't underestimate the degree to which people who voice support for reform are voicing support for none of the above, rather than specifically for a reform platform. But the bind, I think, is, it might just be the case that government can't deliver on its pledges without breaking its promises. If you see what I mean. I mean, that's the tricky situation we find ourselves in. And if that's the case, then actually it might be worth breaking your promises so you can deliver on those pledges. I mean,
because, Rob, arguably some of the votes for Labour were votes for none of the above, or vote for change something, but not quite clear change to what. Isn't that part of the problem now?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. When we look at what was motivating voters last year, and we look at the overall patterns in the vote, you can see that it was very much a public keen to kick out a government that they felt had failed, rather than necessarily endorsing the government that it was bringing in. So coming back to Anand's point about tax pledges versus delivering outcomes, Labour ran on a manifesto with a single word on its cover, which was change. The public made very clear that what they wanted was change, and if change can't be delivered without a significant uplift in money, then I suspect that's what the government has to do. I think failing to deliver change is clearly the bigger risk. And bringing it back to the point about public trust, I think one of the problems with low public trust in politics is it reduces patience. If you say to voters, you just need to wait, the green shoots are there, things will be delivered. Maybe 30 or 40 years ago, that kind of argument would work because voters would be willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. They're not now. They don't have the patience because they don't trust you. And if they don't have the patience and they don't trust you, well, then you've got to try and do the things that will deliver some immediate outcome quickly. Otherwise, you're going to lose anyway. So I think in a low trust, low patience environment, governments have to deliver or governments will be out of office. And if you're faced with the choice of deliver or be out of office, you may as well do the things, whatever it takes to deliver what you promised to do, because failing to do that will mean you're out of office anyway.
So we talked a lot about the government. I wonder if we should talk a little bit about some of the other parties and their policies. I was really struck. Jonathan Portes in his essay says the government's strongest card, at least in the short term, is that of Mrs. Thatcher in the early 80s. There's no obvious or convincing alternative on offer. So I thought I might ask you all to reflect on the policies of the different parties not in government in this space and how the political landscape looks. David?
Yeah, interesting one. So on the one hand, Labour are being critiqued from the left by the Greens and maybe a new party in terms of the need to be bolder, spend more. On the other hand, you've got Reform saying scrap all those green targets, get energy costs down. But it's difficult to see a credible economic plan. So I think Jonathan's point about this being the kind of the only realistic game in town is absolutely right, but that's judging it in terms of government. Your point is, and Rob's point is, if you're in opposition, you don't need to be credible in terms of adding things up. So I think, interestingly, I thought yesterday Reform did make a useful point about pension funds in terms of the fees that are being spent in local government pension funds, something I've been banging on about for a long time. So I thought, actually, they've made a useful point for the first time, from my point of view, about how we might unlock some of that for local economic development. But essentially, there aren't credible alternatives at the moment. Liberal Democrats have welcomed many of the Labour ideas in terms of the industrial strategy. I think the only real critique on the industrial strategy from other parties has been about high energy costs and the need to get those down quickly. And I think that is an area where the government is vulnerable because they've come up with some ideas, British industrial competitiveness scheme, Great British Energy, but they're consulting on it, and we probably won't see reductions in energy prices until 2027 at the earliest. That's too late. There's a big race going on, for example, to attract investment into making electric vehicles, batteries. The UK is not positioned well in that at all because our energy prices are so much higher than in Europe and the United States. So that is another area where they could be doing much more quickly to try and get energy costs down, and that would actually deal with some of the criticism that is coming from other parties.
Good point.
I think one of the things that would be very interesting to see on health, as I've said, that it's really about competence and your ability to deliver and see through performance. And that's probably going to be true across most of the public services. We don't have massive ideological debate. We do now have the first reform councils. Kent, for example, who are taking on then some really big and difficult areas like adult social care, the delivery of education system, special educational needs. And in the next round of council elections, as Rob said, we may see more councils going to other parties. And so then we will have a couple of years before the next general election where, whilst some of these parties obviously haven't been in power nationally, the electorate will have some experience of them running things locally. And what that does both to the way in which they can campaign and how the more established parties use that local experience will be very interesting to see, I think.
And Anne, do you want to come in on this?
With the exception of net zero, it's remarkable how little ideological conflict there is around economic choice. You go to seminars about policy these days and everyone seems to know what the problem is, what the solution is, if only our politicians could put it into place. So I think net zero is the only outlier that I can think of. I think reform are fascinating. They're fascinating because they clearly don't know whether on economics they are left of centre or right of centre, and they will adjust according to what by-elections on the horizon. And reform have got a bit of a problem that comes with success, which is the people they're trying to elect. So people who are saying now they might vote reform have very different preferences to people who already support reform. So a lot of the people who are thinking of defecting to reform from Labour are very supportive of net zero and quite left-wing economically. And I think one of the problems that reform is going to face going forward, if they have that broader electoral coalition, is to struggle to keep that coalition in place by having policies that appeal across the board, which is going to be quite tricky, I think. We've got some polling that I think comes out about reform supporters on Friday during the reform conference, and it does show that making a policy to keep that coalition together is going to be very, very tricky.
I mean, they've shifted quite a bit on industrial strategy, haven't they, to become more interventionists as they've picked up votes in Red Wall 6.
I think steel industry and whatever,
Yeah. It does come back a little bit to the surprising lack of debate about the size of the state and actually, although there's a big debate about tax rises, there's no real debate about whether the state, how the state should be getting smaller, and whether there is an ideological difference between the parties on that is pretty unclear.
Yeah.
Rob, you look like you might want to come in on reform voters and what's driving them.
Yeah, I mean, the credibility question, I think, is an interesting one. I think it's often posed as a binary, but it really isn't a binary. I think for a lot of voters, credibility is one of the things that matters, and the degree to which it matters varies a great deal. So if we take reform, I'd say the first 10 to 15% of reform voters probably aren't that worried about credibility. That's not the reason they're voting reform. It's more of an identity-based argument. But when you're going from 15 to 30%, you're probably getting steadily into voters for whom reform being a credible and competent government matters more. And in that situation, some of the other features of reform is a very young party, a party whose activists are often ideologically very small state. A lot of them are coming from the Thatcherite wing of politics, often directly from the Conservative Party, whereas their electorate tends to be much more economically populist at a minimum, certainly in favour of greater state activism. So there's a natural tension there, and there's also a competence issue which we're seeing in local government now, which is there aren't many people in reform who have any experience running anything in government, and that's going to bring a whole heap of challenges. However, all that said, there are two reasons to think that competence and credibility may not be a silver bullet going into a general election campaign against reform. The first is populist radical right governments in Europe, the current populist radical right president in the United States. They have won despite being quite clearly not very strong on the issue of competence and credibility, because they win using identity-based arguments, using us against them, using two fingers up to the system, amongst a section of the electorate that has essentially lost faith in the ability of government to do anything competently or credibly. And the second reason is you don't need to win all of the voters who care about competence and credibility in a fragmented political system. Reform could win a majority with 30% of the electorate, 30% of the vote. Take the 30% of voters who are least trusting, who are most identity focused, who are most populist, who are most anti-system. Those are not voters who are necessarily that worried about credibility, even if the other 70% really are. So that's the problem, I think. I mean, I think it matters, but whether it matters enough, that's one of the $1 million questions going forward, really.
I'll take a final three questions. If anyone in the room wants to come in, do give me a shout. One at the back there, and Gavin. You choose, Mike.
Thanks very much. Terry O'Neill, Temple Group. Just to go back to the exam question at the top of the hour, growth, an excellent aim. Where does the civil service sit on that question? Are they part of the problem or part of the solution? And if they're part of the problem, what is this government actually going to do about them? Thank you.
Should we do Gavin and the lady? Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. So based on the conversation and just based on watching the world of politics around us, it feels like the cardinal error of this government was to be way too naive about growth turning up because they were grown-ups and stability and so on, and that would lead to a dividend. That was just massively overweighted, which led to complacency about building an argument for tax rises and acting immediately, which led to a delayed initial budget and still very chunky tax rises, but tax rises without an argument that underpinned them sufficiently, and not enough, even though they were significant. And I think there was a bit of a, well, they haven't really done anything on tax. They did a lot on tax, it just wasn't enough. And it didn't give them a ramp to do more. So I think that if that's the error, I think the reason why it feels so hard now is because the timing issue is really difficult now in terms of the next election. Because given that context, if you go out now and do another really big, significant rise and drive a coach and horses through your manifesto, which may be the right thing to do policy-wise in lots of different ways, you may well become even less popular in the short term. I mean, discuss, but you may become less popular at a time when reform, as you people said, are in the 30s, and that's in 2025. The markets are very alive to that at the moment. It is not unrelated to what is happening to gilt yields, but I also think they're looking through it quite a bit because it's a long way out. No one's thinking about the next election seriously yet. If those polls look like that in 2027, 2028, then I think the market reaction to a real prospect of a reform government in terms of gilt yields will be incredibly ugly for the Labour incumbents. And so you just have to sort of... So I think the timing issue is, if we go big now, are we going to become even more unpopular, which will increase the risk of that horrible fiscal doom loop occurring on our watch, which we'll be raising taxes just to sort of stand still? Or do we go big now because otherwise we're completely and utterly lost and we don't have a big argument at the next election? And that feels to me the nub of the choice, which is, it was always going to be hard. And a lot of an angsty panel a year in was kind of baked into like the government being elected because of the context and so on. But the original sin was going too slow and not being ambitious enough. And I think that has pinpointed this really tough timing challenge now.
Great question. Should we take the lady and then I'll take them all together and maybe we'll sneak Jill in.
Thank you. Maria Pavlou from the Office of Public Affairs to the Baha'i Community. And I was just thinking, something that was mentioned before on the panel is about these siloed public services and government sectors that are thinking in very different ways and within different frameworks and often competing for budgets and not really seeing their own success as being tied up with the success of other sectors and other public services. And how do we kind of move from that more competitive, antagonistic structure to a more cooperative one that actually will lead to like some fundamental reform and success for everyone?
So 2 questions there about the kind of structure of the operation, both the civil service and how we might make departments less antagonistic, and then big dilemma from Gavin about whether if the mistake was not to be bold enough, the solution is to be bolder, or whether it's too late. Anyone want to come in on those?
I'll chip in on... So the point about the civil service, I actually think we have a very good civil service. Where I would like to see change is much greater devolution down to a regional level, because even after the reforms that the government is suggesting, we're still in the most centralised, advanced economy. So we've a good civil service, I'd argue, but I'd like to see much more of it in the regions, supporting mayors and regional bodies in terms of delivering things. You said that the original sin was not going bold quick enough. I think the original sin was back as a great piece by Lionel Barber in the Financial Times. The original sin was the Labour tying themselves up on the fiscal side during the general election. Look, they are not going to deliver the change that they're promised without making a fundamental change. So my argument is to go for it. Rob has got a view, no doubt, on whether they'll become more popular or less. I can't actually see how things would get worse for them.
And on devolution, the government's done some things in terms of kind of breadth of local devolution and filling in mayors across the country, but not much yet in terms of kind of depth of devolution. Is that where you think they should
exactly,
go?
Yeah. So, for example, you look at, say, the West Midlands Combined Authority. That is mainly an old transport body. That's 75% of the staff. It doesn't yet have real powers in terms of delivering industrial strategy. Skills is a huge one, which is hugely centralised in the UK. I'd like to see much more of the whole skills agenda done more locally, particularly in the context of some fundamental changes in AI and technologies which are going to destroy a lot of jobs and create new ones. We'd be much better placed having a more skills-based policy at a regional level.
Okay.
Yeah, I do think there are a couple of things which are quite interesting. I mean, Labour came in arguing that it was going to do mission government, and which is that sort of cross-cutting, joined up, long-term and aimed at transformation rather than incremental change. And it hasn't really followed through at all on that. You know, missions have kind of disappeared. And it is quite interesting that during COVID, we actually had really very innovative and quite bold governments. We broke down quite a lot of silos. And across the system, people have retreated back. I mean, in some areas, I think gone backwards. I'll come back to vaccine policy. You know, during COVID, we did amazing things, vaccinating people everywhere, all sorts of different people allowed to vaccinate. In the area I'm involved with the NHS, we're trying to get some pharmacists to be allowed to do some children's vaccines. Oh my Lord, the bureaucracy. You know, and so that would suggest that if people could do it in COVID, it's not a capability, a fundamentally inherent capability thing. There's something in our system which is really very deeply siloed and much more comfortable at slow and incremental change, and the incentives and rewards and all the context in our system must be around that. And I guess where I really worry is in a world of AI and technology, you do not do 3-year randomized controlled trials, evaluate and then increment. And also a lot of what you need is our platforms which are system-wide, and you need to take a bet. You need to make judgment calls and go big, yeah, and then have an approach which iteratively learns in a very dynamic way. Well, yeah, I worked at the Treasury for a decade. That isn't the Treasury way, yeah? And that isn't the rule book, and that isn't a government way. And how do you, and to be an official at the moment and try and suggest that and get that through in anywhere, I really struggle to see how you're going to do that. And missions, I guess, were supposed to try and help cut through and give that sense of purpose against the system. And they've just sort of, I mean, they're just a damn squib, aren't they? So it does feel like some of our machinery of government, and I don't think it's just skills, but some of our deep machinery of government is profoundly unfit for purpose.
And
I mean, for what it's worth on original sin, I think Labour's initial mistake was going along with the second Jeremy Hunt national insurance cut. There was I mean, it was very clear then that they could have turned around and said, no, we're not going to be able to do this in power. I mean, that was the start of that slide for me. On the civil, I mean, you know, I've never worked in government. I've not been up close to the civil service in that sort of way. It strikes me that I'm sure there are ways we can improve how the civil service works, but you can't hold the civil service responsible that we have a government coming in without a plan, without a direction of travel. I mean, in a sense, the civil service hasn't been tried, has it? We haven't had a government that's come in and said, we want to do things differently, we want to change stuff, we're going to force things through, this is what we're trying to do. And I think, you know, going back to Gavin's point, I think it is absolutely right that there was this kind of, I mean, at the time of the election, I thought this can't be the case. There's got to be something more to it than this. They can't simply think that just because we're not the Tories, people will invest, the bond markets will like us, and everything will start to work. And it turned out there was a bit of that thinking. And it's a terrifying thought, isn't it? That a year and a bit in, it might be too late. But I mean, I'm with David, I think. I mean, you might as well suck it and see, because you're not going to do very well if you don't. So actually, I would prefer to see them go down trying, quite honestly. But you're right, acting quick was the only way of doing this. And it was, I mean, I remember the levels of superstition amongst people in Labour in the run up to the election. If you sort of said to them, so when you get in, and it'd be kind of like, shh, don't curse it. You're thinking you're 20 points. I mean, you're going to win this election, okay? You probably should start thinking about what you're going to do after you've won this election. And there seemed to be this real reluctance to think in advance, which is really sad because it means a wasted first year.
On the timing question, I'm not sure I agree with the sort of market doom loop argument, because seems to be the case that markets react quite late to prospects of governments with kind of very radically different fiscal plans. But I think there's a different version of the timing problem, which is they've allocated the money to the NHS. If this is really just about paying for what's already been done, that is a pretty tough sell. And so there's actually a question which is less talked about, which is how many goodies are needed this autumn? What are the things that they want to deliver at the same time as? And it seems to me it would be very difficult to do something radical on tax or break the manifesto without having at least a new thing on the table and not just paying for the things you've already done. Rob, did you have any reflections on this timing question?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's very obsessed with polls, I'm going to make a somewhat unusual argument, which is to be less obsessed with polls. Sort of just to explain what I mean. So a little while ago, I wanted to see how long it was since, if you took where the polls were right now, you could have some sense of where they would be 2 years from now, as in something massively unexpected wouldn't happen that completely shook up the polling landscape. I had to go all the way back to 2011, when the Lib Dems had already lost most of the support they were going to lose in coalition, and Labour were in the lead. And in 2013, that was still the picture. It turned out to be wrong anyway, because the polls were in error in 2015 and Labour's lead was exaggerated. But that was the last period of sustained stability in the polling landscape. And that's now nearly 15 years ago. So I think don't look at the polls now and make your strategy based on that, point number one. Point number two, I think there are many things in life that you can't actually get by aiming at them directly. And maybe popularity in polling is one of them. You don't get trust in life by going around saying, trust me, quite the opposite. You don't acquire authority by going around saying, I have authority. And maybe you don't succeed in government, or you don't succeed with the voters by chasing what the polling numbers are telling you right now. If you look at the other problem that Labour have, apart from the change problem, in all of the focus groups, it's very clear. People say, we don't know what this Labour government is for. We don't know what it is trying to do. Now, maybe the solution to that problem is to say, here are the fights we're going to pick. Here are the things we're going to try to do. And we're just going to ignore everything the polling says about it for a few years, and then go back to the public and say, here is what we did. Here is what we're for. Here's what we're doing. If you like that, elect us again. If you don't like that, then there are some alternatives available, but we think that they're worse. The current situation, where they seem to just chase after whatever the previous month's polling suggests is a good direction to go in, is clearly not working. It might be better to just throw a lot more of those polls in the bin, which, as I say, is not in my career interest perhaps to say that, but I think perhaps it's worth considering.
Thanks, Rob. Conscious we had a few questions on this side of the room, and that, Jill, do you have a question? I can't resist asking you about the civil service as well, Jill.
Can I just say, I asked Anand if I could write a chapter on the civil service of this and machinery of government. He said, no, that's too boring. So that's why it's not in the report, because I think it's really, really interesting. I think Anita's right. I was actually going to ask a question, possibly mainly at you, which is, if we take any lesson from the US election, it's that growth is not enough to win an election. So how do we actually make people, by the time of the election, feel that they're slightly better off? Which may be a resolution foundation question.
And one more.
Thank you, Peter Hurst. What exasperates me is why Labour won't take some of the easy wins, like, for instance, a wealth tax or privatisation of our water companies.
Do you mean nationalisation of the water companies?
Yes.
Right. And Anne, since one was directed at you, do you want to kick us off?
On what it would take on top of growth, I think there are a couple of obvious things. I mean, firstly, people need to see improvements in the health service. The health service is so key to how people see things. And the second thing, and there's a really good piece in the report about it, is about cost of living. People need to feel it in their pockets. It's not enough to have sort of aggregate indicators saying the country is better off. People need to feel it. You need to have wage growth outpacing inflation. And people need to feel it. So there are ways of doing it. And I think in the United States, you're absolutely right. The United States achieves levels of growth that the rest of us would kill for, and yet they seem unhappy with it. But I think some of the distribution of that growth was very, very uneven. And that's a thing we just have to keep an eye on here, is the sort of national level doesn't tell you everything. I mean, that's what the Brexit referendum told us, wasn't it? Was that half the country were missing out on George Osborne's economic miracle. We need to make sure that people feel that in their pockets.
And I think the interesting thing about the US election is that you had growth, but you had high inflation as well. And so the question is whether inflation comes down and whether people feeling it in their pockets is incomes enough, as Mike argues in his essay, that the real question is, can we get incomes to rise faster than inflation? And actually, last year was quite the year for earnings growth, but inflation is looking quite sticky this summer. I think the point you make on energy prices, David, is particularly salient. They're a third higher than they were before the invasion of Ukraine, and that rise in the cost of essentials is still carrying on and is still being felt very keenly by households and not felt evenly across the distribution. So whether growth is enough, I think depends a lot on what happens to inflation and costs as well. And something we haven't talked about so much is the labour market and what's going on there. And I think we are seeing a bit of a divergence between those with a job who are seeing quite fast earnings growth and those who might be looking for a job, which looks like an extremely difficult thing to be doing right now. There's a hiring freeze, if not a kind of a spate of firings. And so how that will play out, particularly in the dynamics between young and old, I think will be really important too. Any other thoughts on questions, David?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also in favour of exploring the possibilities around taxing wealth. To me, that was one of the lessons from the global financial crisis. I think there's a broader issue there of, can we change the tax system to make it more growth friendly? So you tax wealth, but reduce tax on income. But that's a big reform. That isn't going to bring in money quickly, and it's going to have to be thought through very carefully. So that's not a quick fix for the fiscal hole that the government is, but I think it is something we should be thinking about longer term. On water companies, I agree with you entirely. I think the regulatory system was captured by the water companies. There's a belief in government that if they were to nationalise it, it would cost a lot. Let them go bust and pick up the pieces. There are things there that could be done, which would be popular as well.
To wrap us up, and I'll give people a chance to come in with final reflections, I'd like to bring up our poll, which is an attempt to finish optimistic, but we'll see how we go. So if you're online, feel free to give us your answers. Where will the government manage to make most progress in reducing public concern over the next year? So let me get the panel's responses and any final reflections on the discussion. Rob, given it's a question of public attitudes, I wonder if I might put it to you first.
That's a tricky question, and I've been given the least time to think about it. I think by a process of elimination, I don't think the government will make a lot of progress in reducing public concern about inflation and prices, because most of that concern has already gone away. If you look at the most recent Mori data, I don't think they'll make the most progress on defence and foreign affairs, because I think it's outside of their control, and also that's an area that's gone down a lot already. I don't think they will make the most progress on migration, for a slightly more depressing reason, which is the most recent Mori poll showed that 67% of the public think immigration overall has gone up in the past year, and that's in a 12-month period which has seen the largest ever drop in immigration numbers, which suggests there isn't a lot of connection between what's actually happening in the migration system and the level of public concern, which we didn't get into in the discussion today, but is a huge headache for the government going forward, which means I think it's either going to be on the NHS or on the economy. And I suspect, given how far we have to go on NHS waiting lists, I doubt it's going to be that. So although I don't have a lot of optimism that the government will make a great deal of progress on the economy, I think by a process of elimination, it's the best of the 5 available.
That wasn't the optimistic note I was looking for, but it was very interesting. And Anne, what do you think?
I mean, I take Rob's point that defence foreign affairs has got very little to do with what the government does. It's got far more to do with what happens over the Atlantic, in the Middle East. And so my guess would be NHS and healthcare, because actually that's the area where they've actually put some money in.
Yeah.
And if you get a good winter, so you get a warm winter for instance, that could make a massive difference, I think. So I would say that. The one thing I would add to what Rob said about the perception thing, there's a really interesting bit in the report about crime. And one of the things the government is struggling against is the fact that perceptions are way out of kilter with reality. So we have had a steady, significant decrease in rates of crime, but the public, of course, are convinced that crime is going up. And that sort of just speaks to a more general malaise, I think, that it's going to be far, far trickier for the government to address.
I think there's a lot of potential for them to make significant progress on the NHS and healthcare, but I'm going to argue that one thing that might actually be a big risk to derail it is indirectly inflation and prices. Because one of the most important things that they did on coming into office was settle the industrial action. Yeah, but obviously that remains very, very fragile. We had resident doctors on strike at the end of July. Now they didn't get huge amounts of public support and support from colleagues, and they haven't announced any further strikes. Where they sit on that, not sure. Nurses, RCN were also doing some, testing the water balance with their staff. The public spending numbers predicated on the Treasury and their sort of orthodoxy of we'll go into the next pay review body round hard on a low rise. If they're pushing a rise and inflation is sticky and the prospect is that public sector workers will see their earnings fall, we will be, and the government sticks with that, we're potentially then back into industrial action that blows everything off. And it not just blows objective performance off. The important thing to remember is 1.5 million people work in the NHS, and how they feel matters for the conversation they have. I had a procedure last week, and you have quite a bit of chat around your procedure, and that chat can be optimistic or pessimistic, and that influences things. And then 1.5 million people live with families and friends and communities, and what they're saying also kind of matters. So if they're feeling really put upon and hard done by and like the service is rubbish, that has a ripple effect. So I do think inflation and prices are a risk for public sector pay and unrest. And that's another thing that Rachel Reeves has got to think about, and where this very, very orthodox approach is not necessarily helping.
Which brings together how interconnected these things are. And David, I'm tempted to agree with Rob that we have to vote for economy, because if it's not that, then everything else looks pretty bleak.
I fully agree with the logic of what Rob came up with, but I'd probably go with inflation prices, in part, of course, because it's not under the government's control. It's down to the Bank of England. Now, I think inflation will probably peak towards the back end of this year, so there will be scope for the bank to bring down interest rates, and that is going to be key for getting investment going. Mortgage costs come down, depending on what happens with bond markets, and people to feel the benefit. One thing the bank has finally admitted is that its selling of bonds back into the market has been taking money out. So while they've been cutting interest rates, that unwinding of quantitative easing has also been a monetary tightening. So hopefully they can slow that down and have more of a money. Because ultimately what the government is doing is, I've got a fiscal framework. Yes, they've loosened their kind of fiscal policy, but it's still pretty tight in the hope that monetary policy is relaxed. And I'm hoping there'll be scope to do that as the year goes on.
Well, we nearly got through a Resolution Foundation event without quantitative easing, so thank you for correcting that. It's important to do so. I hope that that's been a useful revision guide for everyone, a thought-provoking start to the year. It certainly has for me. Thank you to everyone who contributed to the booklet. There's a lot more food for thought there, and some optimism for Anita in the results of our poll, and huge thanks to the panel and to UK and a Changing Europe in particular for collaborating on this project.
Thank you.
I know.